In the next 10 years, the grid is expected to experience significant load growth, driven by factors like data centers, electrification of vehicles and buildings, and economic development, with forecasts suggesting a substantial increase in electric demand. Some numbers to drive this home, according to the recent CBRE report, include the fact that data center supply in major markets of Northern Virginia, Atlanta, and Chicago surged 34% year over year in 2024. Construction under capacity for data centers in these markets increased between 100 and 200%. So for data center developers, battery system manufacturers, and industries with intensive load demand waiting for utility upgrades, substation build-out, grid interconnection, and regulatory approval is just not going to cut it. As utilities struggle to meet growing demand, many large energy users, particularly data centers and major tech companies, are exploring microgrids, viable alternative to traditional grid expansion. So, is 2025 the turning point for microgrid adoption? And if so, what will the microgrid of the latter half of the decade look like compared to the earlier pilots? To help us understand these questions, we're joined by Dr. Michael Stadler, the co-founder and chief technology officer at Xendee, and a leading expert of microgrid and DER modeling. Michael has been at the forefront of microgrid research and deployment for decades, working with utilities, regulators, and private industry to develop cutting-edge solutions for energy resilience. And as a reminder to those listening in, our podcast now has a video component that you can find on our YouTube channel. If you're listening to audio only and want to watch the video of this conversation, check out the show notes, where we'll have a link to the full video version. And I'm Jason Price, coming to you from New York City. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Chester, Energy Central producer and community manager from Orlando, Florida. Matt, when we talk about microgrids, they've long been a future technology. But do you get the sense that the Energy Central community is now seeing that the future is now?
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. That's exactly what the Energy Central community members are sharing on the platform these days. Microgrids, once we were waiting for the economics and the policy to catch up, but we're no longer talking about hypotheticals. We're talking about what's the present day strategy. And specifically, we see conversations between energy managers, utility planners, especially those in the private sector, areas like data centers, industrial operators. They're all talking about microgrids no longer as a plan B, but as, here's our competitive edge. So as we're moving past pilots and straight into microgrids as the go-to solution, I think it's fair to call 2025 a tipping point.
Thanks, Matt. And before we dive in, a big thanks to West Monroe, our sponsor of today's episode. So without further ado, let's get started in this critical conversation with today's guest, Michael Stadler. Welcome to the Energy Central's Power Perspectives podcast.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Matt. Good being here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we're thrilled to have you. So again, thank you for joining, and let's just dive in. So Michael, microgrids come in various forms. Even though we have an energy and utility audience, how about you break down for us what is a microgrid and its various incarnations?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, there are a couple of definitions around microgrids, but the one that I'm always using is a microgrid is basically a cluster of controllable resources, meaning generation resources, could be photovoltaics, battery systems, combined heat and power systems, but also controllable load resources, which allow us to control them. And by co-locating generation resources with the loads, we can achieve some benefits in microgrids, meaning we have less losses in the system because we don't have to transport energy that far, right? We can utilize waste heat from a CHP system and heat a building or cool something down. So overall, microgrids are really trying to increase the system efficiency and provide energy not only for electricity, but also for heating, cooling, or maybe hydrogen at lower costs and maybe also more reliably.
Okay. So, I mean, microgrids, as we know, it's a hot topic. It's been like that for years, a lot of discussion around it, but the adoption has been incremental at best. You're in a front row seat of all this. So are we finally at that inflection point where microgrids are moving beyond the pilot and more widespread adoption and deployment?
Well, from our perspective, microgrids have been growing very nicely. I mean, I guess it depends on the viewpoint, but we have seen strong growth and we're in an exponential growth. And in 2023, I mean, we saw a market value of $32 billion US, which is expected to grow to $170 billion by 2032. So, microgrids are real. The real cases in the military, I mean, communities and universities are really using them. And we have clients at Xendee which really build hundreds of microgrids a year. So I think we already have seen that inflection point in the past.
All right. Well, at the lead up to the call, in the intro, I mentioned AI and data center growth. I mean, this is massive new loads that utilities are struggling to keep up with. So you've been working with data centers looking to bypass, grid constraints by going with microgrids. How is this approach working, and why are microgrids particularly well suited for this need?
So with data centers, it's like with the electric vehicle infrastructure that we have seen the last couple of years. It's really about the power demand, which is driving the challenge here. So it's not necessarily the energy. It's more like to get really the power that is needed to the data center, because we're talking about, we have seen projects in the gigawatt range, right? So it's really an infrastructure problem. And we know that upgrading the infrastructure can take time. We have seen that it can take 7 to 10 years that the utility sector is upgrading the point of common coupling with the site. So that's not a viable solution most of the time for data centers. And this is why they're looking at co-location of generation resources or microgrids, right? And I think actually data centers are really well suited for this, because in the past, they have been dealing with backup generation anyway. So from our perspective, it's just a, in quotes, small step to actually build out a real microgrid here. And that's what we are seeing with our clients.
By definition, and you described it, microgrids can basically island itself as a backup solution. So how do you see the function of microgrids evolving in the latter half of the decade? If there's all this growth and it's always being more of a backup focus, is it at what point is it going to become the primary focus? Right. And will it be a combination of the two? Just what is your general impression of where this market is going?
So I guess it's again dependent on the viewpoint, because we were digging out some statistics here, and based on what we have found with research and in the statistics is that actually 2/3 of the microgrid at the moment are grid connected. So they're not really niche markets when it comes to islanded systems. Microgrids really live from this benefit to do cost management. We have really high energy prices in some parts of the country. We have demand charges, power charges, right? Time of use rates. And 60% of those microgrids that are in the market are actually designed to mitigate those cost numbers. So I would say that they are mostly built for economic reasons and not for islanded situations.
So one of the challenges has always been cost justification, especially compared with just relying on utility infrastructure. What does the business case for microgrids look like today?
Well, as already briefly mentioned earlier, it's mostly cost management. Yes, microgrids are built for resiliency purpose, like in California, right? Because we have earthquakes or for hurricanes. But we see that it's always about cost management, and this is how you make money with a microgrid, because you want to manage your costs. You want to participate in markets and maybe ancillary service markets that change energy with the utility. So the business case is really cost management, augmented, of course, with resiliency purposes. And of course, in some areas, like Africa, we still see microgrids getting built for electrification purposes, and we are involved in those projects. But it's really a cost driver. And we know that in many parts of the country, microgrids can generate electricity cheaper than it would be provided by the utility system.
I want to ask about interconnection process, the interconnection queue. It just seems to be such a hot topic. At every conference I go to, it's just all this frustration and strategies to, help with the throughput of the interconnection queue that we see. So from your observation, are we seeing true grid defection going on, or do most microgrids still maintain some level of grid connectivity? And what does the environment mean for the utility leaders listening today, decision makers today? What does it mean for them when we hear about, the risks of grid defection?
Yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right. Everyone who comes to us, either using the software or engineering services, complains about this problem, really get this interconnection. And we have seen this already in the past with EV infrastructure. So it's real. And of course, a lot of people are so disappointed that they say, well, I don't want to deal with this, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, the distribution system provides some services, and it would be foolish to completely disconnect in many cases, right? But we see grid defection in the sense that future load growth is actually covered by the microgrid. So if a business wants to grow, then they are planning this in a way that the microgrid will cover the future growth. And of course, they stay interconnected because there's some energy exchange and makes it faster. But in most cases that we have seen, then there's some form of grid interconnection still going on. But it's not that they're upgrading it in this way. They can avoid these long lead times. It's just more like to hedging the risk with this load growth that they're seeing and providing the energy that is needed for different means.
Let me ask you, all these states have GHG, goal reduction goals to hit. And so it's somewhat of a two-part question here. The first is, you're in a state that has aggressive GHG goals, and let's say all these microgrids come online, and they're all gas-powered. How is that treated in the thinking process and the goal setting that the state had made? And then following up for that, I mean, my understanding with microgrids is that there are many means or many ways to run them to generate the power, and it could be renewable energy that runs the microgrid to gas-driven energy to run the microgrid. So help us through this balancing act of, the cost, the carbon generation, the reliability, just all this that plays into this entire equation.
No, you have very good points here. And I mean, from our perspective, microgrid is a concept, right? I mean, and I'm technology agnostic. I mean, you can build a microgrid with just CHP systems, natural gas-fired engines, right? Of course, you can put in renewables, battery systems, whatever it is. I mean, we can take care of almost 25 technologies in a microgrid when we model them and implement them, right? But what you're really using at the end of the day depends on your objective and your goal. Because and you're right. I mean, in California, we have seen the last couple of years a lot of projects which were just focused on greenhouse gas reduction, right? And we saw projects popping up just with PV systems, battery systems, whatever it is, right? But then it's also becoming a cost question, right? Because you can do maybe resiliency management with a CHP system or generator cheaper and not impacting your greenhouse gas emissions too much, right? So, and this is how we are helping here with our technology. We have basically a platform, a system approach, which helps you to really define your goals, combine it with the market constraints, and then figure out, depending on what you want to achieve, what is the best technology mix. And for data centers, I mean, we see at the moment a lot of projects which will, of course, put in batteries because they want to do demand charge management. They want to reduce the costs, or they want to participate in the market. Some of those projects also participate in ancillary service markets to exchange energy. But a lot of them actually use also combined heat and power, because with a CHP system, you can reduce your electricity demand for cooling, because traditionally you have all your cooling met by electricity, which means you have a high electricity load. You have the AI, the data center load, and you have the cooling load. But if you use the waste heat from a CHP system in an absorption chiller, you can reduce your cooling load. So what you're really using in a microgrid depends on your objective, on your loads. And this is how we are helping here by providing this modeling capabilities and knowledge to actually figure out which is the best technology combination for your project, for your state. And of course, they can be different, right? I mean, if you have cheap natural gas, then of course you will see some CHP systems or other engines popping up if you're more concerned about the costs. But that's the flexibility of a microgrid, which I think is really important, because you can run a microgrid which is natural gas based, you can run a microgrid which is renewable based, or it can be a combination of it.
Michael, we're talking now at a time when we're 3 months into the new administration. So I'd love to get some perspectives here on the role of government, the policies, maybe the lack of consistency with some of these policies. There's been a push for grid resilience and even some funding around microgrids, as I understand and have read. some of that's being pulled back now. What role do you see policymakers, regulators, other stakeholders in influencing the microgrid market? Do you feel like they're going to help accelerate it? Do you think it'll help? They'll put policies in place to slow it down or even retract growth in microgrids? Just where is the market going? Where's your head in that?
Of course, historically, all this funding was really supportive and helped us to get the microgrid market going. Yes, the states put still a lot of money into microgrids. But the point here is, I think microgrids are mature technology as a concept, right? So you don't really need funding to build a microgrid. You need some support when it comes to certain aspects of microgrids. For example, the control problem. And, how you control a microgrid that is already implemented will impact the benefits, right? And there are certain ways of doing this, and there are more sophisticated ways, there are less sophisticated ways. And for example, in California, we see research is going to in this area, right? But overall, and that's interesting maybe for some of you here listening, we actually posted the best quarter that we ever had at our company in the microgrids market. So that we were really worried about this uncertainty, but since microgrids are really available and can reduce the costs, people are really doing them. What changed is we see them now more like a cost reduction measure or resiliency measure until last November or so with the last administration, it was more about greenhouse gas emission reduction. This is why we saw different technologies in the mix. But now we actually see that a lot of people, data center industry communities are really interested to create a stable solution for cost reduction. And for us, it has been actually great. And as I said, we had a lot of new projects, and I have also some other data. The last 365 days, we actually optimized 80,000 different microgrid case scenarios in our platform. So that's an indication that the market is really in an exponential growth, as I said early on. And yes, there's uncertainty, but so far it hasn't materialized, at least on our side.
Could you throw some numbers out? Like first of all, how many microgrids are currently operating in the United States or North America? And then what is the average cost to develop a microgrid?
So I think it would be not really a good way to throw out here a concrete number, because you can have a microgrid really small and you can have a large microgrid, right? So, I'm sitting here in California, and my house here has a microgrid on it, which of course costs maybe $40,000, $50,000 PV and battery, right? But then of course you could have a data center, which is in the hundreds of millions, I don't know, because we want to carry 1 gigawatt load. So there's no real number for this. And that's also the beauty about microgrids, because they can come in very small forms and large forms. They're very flexible. That's actually the point here. So, it can be couple of $100,000, but of course it can go into the hundreds of millions if it's a large system, right? And this also means that you can have microgrids in the kilowatt range. I have a microgrid running at my house, which is in the 10 kilowatt range, and I'm saving there 80% of my costs. But of course you can have a data center which has 500 megawatts and maybe saves 40% of the costs, because it will be hard to really supply data center in the 500 megawatt range completely through a microgrid, unless you have new technologies like small modular reactors, which are not available at the moment, right? And this is why data centers are also focusing on generation resources to actually provide that power.
All right. Very good. All right. So, Michael, we're going to give you the final word. However, we're going to go now to what we call the lightning round, which gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So we're going to throw some questions at you. Very, very straightforward, simple questions. We ask you to keep your response to one word or phrase or sentence. And are you ready?
Sure. Go ahead.
All right. So here goes. What's your guilty pleasure TV show or movie?
Sounds funny, maybe, but it's Magnum P.I., the original series from the 80s, because it's really a cult thing, and it reminds me to growing up, actually. So
That's great. That's a good show. We're collecting lightning round questions from past podcast guests to ask future guests. So this question comes from Veronica Ung Kono at the National Wildlife Fund, who was on the show, and she asked the following question. What is one accomplishment that you've achieved that you would be excited to share with your younger self?
Well, one thing is, I would say stick to your goals and stay on track because I think I got a little bit diluted along the way. At the end, it worked out nicely, and I got a nice reward from the White House back in 2016. But I think it's really important to really stick to your ideas and work them out.
Now it's your turn. What lightning round question do you want to challenge a future guest to answer? And of course, it can be topical or anything that's off the wall. It's your call.
Maybe when you were a kid, what was your dream job? And I ask about this because I always wanted to become a pilot, but hell, I'm happy that I not became a pilot because it would be too much traveling for me now. So
I'm going to throw a curveball at you. What is some service or technology that no longer exists, but perhaps was available in the past that you would vote to bring back?
Cell phones, because I'm too fed up with smartphones because they just take too much of my time.
All right. And the last question, the question we often ask many of our guests, and that is, what are you most passionate about?
It's the nexus between energy and software. And I think this is why I'm doing this job that I'm doing. I really like hands-on work in the software field. And I think this is why microgrids are so great because they need a lot of software and planning.
Well, since you were a champion at the lightning round, I said it would give you the final word. So knowing that you've got a listening audience of utility leaders and decision makers, what is one piece of advice or reason for optimism as you give your final soliloquy to this audience?
Well, I realized that I'm pretty strong on microgrids, and I think the utility industry does not always want to hear that, right? But I think I don't think that the utility system is going away because it's really providing a good service, and it really created the foundation for a strong economy. I mean, worldwide, right? But I think some things can be done more efficiently now with microgrids, and I think it would be good to see this as a combination between a utility system and a microgrid, because I think it also could save some money to the utility industry. And we know that some utilities working on microgrids, but when it comes to infrastructure investments, I personally would be very careful doing them because they could be stranded at some point. For example, if small modular reactors are really becoming real and they're located with data centers, then all these investments that we are doing right now in infrastructure might be obsolete. So I think microgrids can be really good if we use them the right way. And if I would be in the utility industry, I mean, I would certainly build them and plan them for my clients.
Okay. Well, thoughtful and insightful words from someone who sits in the middle of the microgrid world. So definitely things to think about. And I know that our audience are going to have lots of questions and comments, and we invite our listeners to post questions and engage with Michael and keep the conversation going. So until then, though, we want to thank you for sharing your insights on today's episode of the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
You bet. You can always reach Michael through the Energy Central platform, where he welcomes your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to our podcast sponsors that made today's episode possible. Thanks to West Monroe. West Monroe is a leading partner for the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, and workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.